Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the world knows, the Syrian people have suffered terribly under the prolonged brutality of the Assad regime. On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, did the U.S. suffer any losses initially? And more broadly, could you, the President in his remarks said that the U.S. and its allies are prepared to sustain this operation until the Syrians stop using chemical weapons. Does this mean that the U.S. and its partners will continue military operations beyond this initial operation tonight?
That will depend on Mr. Assad should he decide to use more chemical weapons in the future. And of course the powers that have signed the chemical weapons prohibition have every reason to challenge Assad should he choose to violate that. But right now this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
The U.S. lost.
We'll brief on that in the morning. We're not. We want to give you a full brief in the morning. Right now, we have no reports
strategy is something that has eluded certainly the prior administration.
Thank you for doing that. Have you seen any retaliation from the Russians or the Iranians? And how long do you think this operation could last? Is it a matter of hours or days, or could go longer than that?
Yeah, we did have some initial surface-to-air missile activity from the Syrian regime. That's the only retaliatory action that we're aware of at this time. And the nature of the operation, we've completed the targets that were assigned to the United States Central Command. Those operations are complete.
General Dunford and also Secretary Mattis, could you talk a little bit more about your concerns that you've expressed earlier in the week about Russian escalation? General Dunford, were you able to talk to your Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov? What are your concerns about escalation? And if we're permitted to ask your British counterpart a question, I would like to know the sense of your government about whether the situation with the Skripals and the Russian involvement in that, how that Russian involvement played a role in your decision to enter this coalition this evening.
Barbara, let me address the last point first. Our attachés were kind enough to join us this evening. They're not going to get out in front of their president and prime minister respectively, so that the national messages will be provided from their capitals here very soon. But with regard to the Russian concerns, we specifically identified these targets to mitigate the risk of Russian forces being involved, and we used our normal deconfliction channels. Those were active this week to work through the airspace issues and so forth. We did not do any coordination with the Russians on the strikes, nor did we pre-notify them.
Mr. Secretary, it was just a couple of days ago that you said you're still assessing the intelligence on the chemical weapons attack, suspected attack. So at this point, do you know what the chemical was used in that attack? Was it sarin? Was it chlorine? And also, what is your evidence it was actually delivered by the Syrian regime?
Say the last part again, Tom.
What's your evidence it was delivered by the Syrian regime? Are you quite clear it was?
I am confident the Syrian regime conducted a chemical attack on innocent people in this last week. Yes, absolutely confident of it. And we have the intelligence level of confidence that we needed to conduct the attack.
As far as the actual chemical used, do you know what it was? Was it nerve agent? Was it chlorine? Do you have a sense of what it was?
We are very much aware of one of the agents. There may have been more than one agent used. We are not clear on that yet. We know at least one chemical agent was used.
I just want to clarify on the deconfliction line. You notified the Russians ahead of time, before the operation began, what you were going to do and what targets you were going to strike?
Gordon, to be clear, the only communications that took place specifically associated with this operation before the targets were struck was the normal deconfliction of the airspace, the procedures that are in place for all of our operations in Syria.
General Dunford, you mentioned that the the Syrian air defenses had engaged. The Syrian state TV is saying they shot down 13 Tomahawk missiles. Can you refute that?
Jennifer, I can't tell you the results. We literally, as you know, the time on target was about an hour ago, and we came straight up here to give you the best information we have right now. Tomorrow morning, as the Secretary will talk about in a minute, we'll give you the more detailed operational update and some of the details, but those details aren't available to us right now.
This wave of airstrikes is over.
This wave of airstrikes is over. That's why we're out here speaking to you now.
Secretary Mattis, I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the legal basis for this strike. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because in your testimony the other day, it sounded like you were saying that this a potential strike would somehow be linked to self-defense and the presence of American forces in Syria. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also regarding whether or not there will be future action or additional strikes. You said that it would depend on whether or not the Assad government conducts future chemical attacks, but can you explain a little bit more about what would be the threshold for that? Because there were repeated chemical attacks between the April 2017 attack and today, and would you consider a small-scale chlorine attack sufficient to launch additional strikes?
Right now, I will just tell you we're in close consultation with our allies. We review all the evidence all the time. It is difficult, as you know, to get evidence out of Syria, but right now we have no additional attacks planned. But as far as the legal authority under the Article 2 of the Constitution, we believe the President has every reason to defend vital American interests, and that is what he did here tonight under that authority.
Hey, sir, I have a couple questions for General Dunford. What were some of the targeting considerations or difficulties involved with going after chemical facilities? How long did the operation take to plan? And for Secretary Mattis, last year's strikes were described as proportional, moderate. How would you describe this year's in contrast to that?
Yeah, Tony, we chose these particular targets to mitigate the risk of civilian casualties, number one. We chose these targets because they were specifically associated with the chemical program, the Syrian chemical program. And obviously, when we take a look at target planning and so forth, we look at the location relative to other populated areas, collateral damage, proportionality. So these targets were carefully selected with proportionality, discrimination, and being specifically associated with the chemical program.
All standoff weapons or any manned aircraft?
There were manned aircraft involved. I won't give you any of the details operational until tomorrow morning, but we will do that at that time.
Sir, instead of proportional last year,
a question to Secretary Mattis. So up until yesterday, and I'm going to quote you here, you said, "I cannot tell you that we have evidence." So when did you become confident that a chemical attack happened? And the second one...
Yeah, yesterday.
Yesterday, after you said that?
Yes.
And then second, you talked about targeting the chemical weapons infrastructure of al-Assad. If there were actually any chemical weapons or agents in those facilities that you targeted, I assume they would create health hazard in the region or not?
Yeah, we don't believe. We did very close analysis. As the chairman pointed out, we did everything we could in our intelligence assessment and our planning to minimize to the maximum degree possible any chance of civilian casualties. We are very much aware this is difficult to do in a situation like this, especially when the poison gas that Assad assured the world he had gotten rid of obviously still exists. So it is a challenging problem set, and we had the right military officers dealing with it.
So you can confirm there's going to be no leak into the air? Or
of course not. We'll do our best.
Chairman Dunford, when the surface-to-air defenses engaged, did they become a target, and did U.S. air power or other assets take out those targets?
Yeah, Tara, I'm not aware of any response that we took right now. Again, we'll gather overnight. As you can imagine, we tried to leave the United States Central Command alone here tonight. They were quite busy. We'll, through the night, gather the operational detail, and we'll be back tomorrow morning to provide that to you.
Yeah, Secretary Mattis or Chairman Dunford. Last year, you changed the force protection levels for the Syrian troops, U.S. troops that were in Syria. There are 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. Have you changed force protection levels based on potential responses from Russia?
Yeah, Hans, as you can imagine, the commander always takes prudent measures, especially in an environment that they were in tonight, so they did make adjustments.
And just to be clear on the deconfliction line, you told them that you're going to be operating in airspace, but you didn't tell them, the Russians, what the targets were?
That is absolutely correct. We used the normal deconfliction channels to deconflict the airspace that we were using. We did not coordinate targets or any planning with the Russians.
What was their response, sir?
That information was passed at the operational link from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, so I wasn't on the line. But that kind of information, just to put it in perspective, is passed routinely every day and every night. So they may not have found anything unusual about that particular airspace deconfliction.
Thank you so much, Katrina Manson from the Financial Times. Can you talk a little bit about any Iran targets that you initially, Iran-associated targets that you initially considered, and why you may have not gone for them? And could your colleagues explain exactly the sort of contribution that you've made to tonight's operation?
Yeah, again, our allied officers are here out of respect for the fact that they were part of the mission from planning all the way through to the political decision taken. And once their heads of state speak tomorrow, then that'll be the initial statement from those capitals. But as far as any other targets, we looked at targets specifically designed to address the chemical weapons threat that we have seen manifested. The whole world has watched in horror these weapons being used. Those were the only targets that we were examining for prosecution.
Mr. Secretary, General Dunford, you mentioned 3 target areas that were struck. How can you be sure that from now on these are all of the target areas or all of the involved production facilities for chemical weapons that the Syrians are using? And do you believe that there are additional locations where they are producing such materials?
This is a great question. We had a number of targets to select from, and again, we did not select those that had a high risk of collateral damage and specifically a high risk of civilian casualties. And so the weaponeering, back to the earlier question, the weaponeering was done, the modeling was done to make sure that we mitigated the risk of any chemicals that were in those facilities and mitigate the risk of civilian casualties. So were there other targets that we looked at? There were. We selected these specific targets both based on the significance to the chemical weapons program as well as the location and the layout.
Thanks. Secretary Mattis, it seems like this strike tonight was pretty limited, not too dissimilar from last year. I know it was three targets this time instead of 1, but it still seems a little bit more targeted and more specific than what I think a lot of people were expecting. Can you walk us through your decision to, did concern about escalation with Russia affect your decision to keep this more targeted? And moving from there, how much assurance can you give us that this is going to do what the strike last year didn't do, which is basically to stop President Assad from using chemical weapons again?
Nothing is certain in these kinds of matters. However, we used a little over double the number of weapons this year than we used last year. It was done on targets that we believed were selective to hurt the chemical weapons program. We confined it to the chemical weapons type targets. We were not out to expand this. We were very precise and proportionate, but at the same time, it was a heavy strike.
Mr. Secretary, prior to the attack, how important was it to get the support from the allies, not only from an intelligence point of view, but also just from the countries themselves?
It's always important that we act internationally in a unified way over something, especially that is such an atrocity as this, that we've observed going on in Syria. But I would also tell you that these allies, the Americans, the French, the British, we have operated together through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And this is a very, very well integrated team. Wherever we operate, we do so with complete trust in each other, the professionalism, but more than that, the belief that one another will be there when the chips are down. So it's important, and it's a statement about the level of trust between our nations.
General Dunford, could you just let us know whether the Syrians were able to hide a lot of these chemical weapons in the last several days, since there's been so much talk about a possible strike? Did that give the Syrians time to kind of move some of these weapons off limits? And then Secretary Mattis, just to confirm earlier when you were saying you had information about one of the chemicals, but we're all assuming that means chlorine, that you had information confirming chlorine, but not necessarily sarin. If you could just clarify that part.
Yeah, Phil, the first question, I'm not aware of any specific actions that the Syrians took to move chemical weapons in the last couple of days.
Yeah, we're very confident that chlorine was used. We are not ruling out sarin right now.
General, I'd like to follow up on Lewis's question about the targets that you first examined and then triaged down to the 3 tonight. It sounds like you went after facilities and not the actual weapons, as indicated earlier, to minimize accidental risk to civilians. In the targets that remain, could you characterize perhaps the ability for Syria to ramp up again and again have chemical weapons?
Yeah, I think it's too early to make that assessment. It's too early to make that assessment right now.
The last question, General.
Thank you. General Dunford, did any Russian defenses engage U.S., British, or French ships or missiles? And Secretary Mattis, were any of the strikes tonight intended to kill Bashar al-Assad?
The only reaction that I'm aware of at this time was Syrian surface-to-air missiles. I happen to be down in the National Military Command Center and was aware of that activity. I'm not aware of any Russian activity, and I'm not aware of the full scope of the Syrian regime response at this time. Again, those will be details we'll pull together for you in the morning.
Yeah, the targets tonight, again, were specifically designed to degrade the Syrian war machine's ability to create chemical weapons and to set that back right now. There were no attempts to broaden or expand that target set. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming in this evening. Based on recent experience, we fully expect a significant disinformation campaign over the coming days by those who have aligned themselves with the Assad regime. And in an effort to maintain transparency and accuracy, my Assistant for Public Affairs, Ms. Dana White, and Lieutenant General McKenzie, the Director of the Joint Staff here in Washington, will provide a brief of known details tomorrow morning. We anticipate about 9 o'clock in this same location. But thank you again for coming in this evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you go. You've been watching the Pentagon briefing there given by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General James Dunford, and the Defense Secretary, General James Mattis, at the Pentagon, updating America and the world really on the airstrikes that have now landed in Syria at this hour. A couple of things before we get to our folks who are following this story, including our man on the ground there in northern Syria. The General James Mattis started by saying that the people of Syria has suffered terribly under this Assad regime, and then talking about the atrocities, saying the atrocities were unacceptable, also saying that they were taking as much precaution as possible so that civilians would not be hit. He said that he is confident that chlorine gas was used, but not sure about sarin, saying they used double the weapons this year as last year. As you remember, there was an airstrike on Syria this time last year as well. Said that they were very precise, they were proportionate, but it was a heavy strike. Lots to get to, lots to talk about in the coming hours here on CNN as the airstrikes have now hit Syria. I want to get to CNN's Jim Sciutto, also Pamela Brown at the White House, and Nick Payton Walsh, as I said, who is in northern Syria. I'm going to begin now, though, with Jim. Jim, we heard Secretary Mattis talk about targets tonight and what the goal of this strike, what the goals are. Tell us about that.
Don, we learned a lot in that briefing from Mattis and Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. First of all, Mattis made very clear, he said this was a one-time shot, a limited one-night strike purely on chemical weapons facilities. That is not. They don't have the evidence standard that they had set out early on as distinguishing this attack. And that raises this question going forward, Don, because if they have said that the next time the Assad regime uses these weapons, the U.S. will give a military response, look at the past year. Chlorine gas has been used by this regime dozens of times over the course of the past year. Does that mean the U.S. is going to respond militarily to each one of those? you could say the administration has set something of a red line here that's going to be tested going forward.
Well, and Jim, he did say, he says this is a one-time shot right now to dissuade him, meaning Bashar al-Assad, from doing it again, but also indicating that, saying it's a one-time shot to dissuade him. Dissuade meaning if he doesn't do it, then there's a possibility of more strikes. Again, you mentioned Russia.
And he said that explicitly. He said a one-time shot unless they see the use of this kind of weapons again.
Again, yeah. And you mentioned Russia. He said no coordination with the Russians, nor did we pre-notify them. And I want to get to Barbara Starr now. Barbara, I think it's important to point out, Jim talked about the kinds of weapons used and the types of facilities that were targeted. A scientific research center in the Damascus area where he believes that they were testing chemicals. A chemical weapons storage facility west of home, he said, where they believe sarin gas may have been stored there. Chemical weapons storage facility and so on. 3 different targets, all relating to chemical weapons.
Don, what is so extraordinary is what you just mentioned, that they went downtown Damascus essentially and struck a target in Damascus associated with Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons research capability. Damascus is a city, and the other location you mentioned, Homs. This is an area of Syria that is heavily defended by both Syrian and Russian air defenses. They did mention that they saw some activity by Syrian air defenses. We will learn tomorrow whether any of the Allied missiles were potentially, in fact, shot down by those air defenses. But the U.S., the Allies, have not gone to Damascus in the past. That is something that is very new. On the question of whether they will do this again, the president talked about the potential for a sustained response, but he was not specific on whether he meant a military response. So the secretary stepping in and saying tonight that this is where it stands. This is complete unless Assad uses chemical weapons again. I suspect this is an effort to tell the American people that they are not entering a new war against this Syrian regime at this point, but reserving the capability to go after this again. Again, very, very focused on Assad's chemical weapons capability. That is clearly what they wanted to go after. We expect another military briefing here early in the morning where we will learn more about exactly what assets were used, what aircraft, what ships may have launched missiles, and what essentially the result is at first light. What wreckage will there be? And I think it's really interesting that the secretary concluded by saying that he fully expected essentially a disinformation, a propaganda campaign on this by those associated with the Assad regime. Make no mistake, they feel very strongly that the Russians will step in the coming hours and put out a lot of information that the Allies will say is not true. And so they are going to come out tomorrow, they say, and be as transparent as they can in advance of what essentially they feel may be a Russian propaganda campaign on this, Don.
Barbara Starr, I want you to stand by at the Pentagon. Barbara Starr at the Pentagon, where the briefing was held just a short time ago, and reiterating the targets specifically associated with chemical weapons. As I get to Nick Payton Walsh, 5:30 a.m. and obviously in the morning there, First Light. Barbara mentioned First Light, mentioned the targets there, a chemical weapons storage facility, another chemical weapons storage facility and command post as well, and also a scientific research center in the Damascus area where they believe they were testing these chemicals. Nick, take us there. What are you seeing now and what's going on?
Well, I'm obviously in northern Syria, far from these regime-held areas. I'm in the area where Syrian Kurds are in control with U.S. forces backing them. But let's go through the areas we're talking about here. Damascus facility for the development and production of chemical weapons here. As Barbara pointed out, that's within the sort of more heavily defended parts of the capital. Importantly, though, it's Homs where 2 targets appear to have been hit. That key city sort of to the north far of Damascus there along the border with Lebanon. That one of the second facilities Jim Mattis referred to, General Dunford referred to, is a primary sarin production and storage facility. Important because although Jim Mattis wouldn't be specific about what they thought that the chemical used was, it may be some sort of sarin-like mixture melded in with chlorine. Sarin is clearly within their target list here. A third target nearby that Homs facility. Remember, there's the British who say some of their Shadow Storm missiles seem to have been sent in the direction of Homs. The third target was also a command post, as well as being involved in the production and storage of chemical weapons too. There have been some social media reports hinting at maybe Kushner being one of those possible targets here. A lot of other things on social media and in media reports, loyal to the state media from eyewitnesses too, suggest things may have been hit as well that are outside of the limited target list mentioned by Secretary Mattis and General Dunford there. But that, of course, is the confusion of perhaps anti-aircraft rounds being involved, maybe explosions reverberating off hillsides and sort of depending on the geography of where you are. So a lot of information coming around here now. Syrian state television has claimed that some of the attacks on Homs were in fact thwarted. Now, Secretary Mattis General Dunford, it was referred to surface-to-air missile retaliation by the regime being noted by then. But I have to point out here, Don, from the moment in which we first heard eyewitness reports in Damascus while Donald Trump was speaking of first explosions, to the moment in which Jim Mattis said it was over, was an hour and 10 minutes. So an incredibly small 70-minute window for these strikes to occur. A lot of the places I've been talking to you about too historically appear to have been reported to have been hit in the past, often by Israeli jets who've had a lot of sorties into Syria over the past years, taking out specific threats that concern them. On top of that, too, Reuters are in fact quoting a senior pro-Assad official, unnamed, suggesting that if this is it, this has been comparatively limited. So perhaps the messaging from Damascus, even though these strikes are frankly the worst their residents will have seen for quite some time, we haven't really had people responding on social media or across the sort of Syrian body politic on the regime side like this for quite some time. There may be an effort by the regime to suggest that this is comparatively limited in the damage that it has done, although, as they said, the US used the double number of weapons that they did in April of last year, and they say the US that in April last year they took out 20% of the regime's air force.
Nick, I need to jump in
and much damage to have been done.
And tell the viewer, thank you, Nick. I need to jump in and tell you these are live pictures now that you're getting now from the region that we're looking at. Again, according to the generals there at the press briefing, the only Syrian response so far, surface-to-air missiles. But again, this all started at 9 p.m. Eastern time, a coordinated effort between France, Britain, and the United States. Again, targets specifically, they say, associated with the chemical weapons. They believe that are still there. Bashar al-Assad promised those chemical weapons would be gone, but as the general said, obviously not. They have confirmation, they believe, that he used chlorine on innocent people. He conducted chemical attacks on innocent people. Nick is standing by in the region. Meantime, I want to get to Washington now. Pamela Brown is standing by. Pamela, the president addressed the nation tonight to explain this attack. He talked about a sustained attack. That's not what Secretary Mattis said. Secretary Mattis said this one-time attack now, unless Bashar al-Assad does not get the message.
That's clear. There seem to be differing messages there from what we heard with the president saying that the U.S. is prepared for a sustained response, and from Secretary Mattis saying that essentially for now this operation is over with. And when you look at the backstory of this week leading up to today, it helps paint a clearer picture of why that is. The president throughout this week has been pushing for a stronger campaign, a more muscular response, Don. On the other hand, Secretary Mattis and other Pentagon officials have been more reticent for that, because their concern has been if it's not a calibrated response, then it could bring the U.S. in direct conflict with Russia, and that's the last thing that they want. Now, that said, Don, this is certainly a more robust, coordinated effort in terms of strikes against Syria than what we saw last year. As Secretary Mattis said, we struck harder compared to last year, where there was one target. There are multiple targets this year. He said around double the number of weapons were used in this case. I can say one of the questions raised tonight is the lack of congressional approval. That is something that people are discussing. The president himself in August of 2013 criticized President Obama, saying he must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not. That didn't happen, though we are told that White House officials, other administration officials did alert leaders on Capitol Hill of what would be happening here. Also, you have Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi Pelosi, others coming out raising questions about the strike, saying this is not a comprehensive strategy on Syria. Certainly there are questions when you hear the president say on one hand, we are prepared to do a sustained strike, and on the other, a sustained response, and on the other hand, saying that we will not have a definite presence in Syria. That is not something we want. It does raise the question of what the overall strategy is there in Syria, but certainly this is the Trump administration's second direct military engagement with the Assad government. Don?
All right, Pamela Brown standing by at the White House. Pamela, we will get back to you in the coming minutes here on CNN. We're following the breaking news out of Syria, the Pentagon holding a press briefing just moments ago. Also, the President of the United States first announcing these airstrikes on Syria, talking about Russia, specifically calling out Russia, saying that Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path, adding that hopefully someday we'll get along with Russia and Iran, but adding maybe not. Also, Russia calling on Iran and Russia specifically, asking them what kind of nation they want to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children. Also saying that they will be judged by their company, by the company they keep. I want to get now to Jim Sciutto. Back to Jim Sciutto in Washington. Jim, the Russians have just responded to the strikes. What have you heard?
That's right. This coming from Russia's ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Antonov, and he says the following: the worst apprehensions have come true. Our warnings have been left unheard. A pre-designed scenario is being implemented. He says, again, we are being threatened. We warn that such actions will not be left without consequences. He continues, all responsibility for them rests with Washington, London, and Paris. Of course, the three countries that participated in these strikes. Insulting the president of Russia is unacceptable and inadmissible. That apparently, Don, a reference to the president's tweet earlier this week. The U.S., the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. So quite a strong pushback, as you would expect there from Russia. I should note again that you heard from Defense Secretary Mattis that this strike was directed purely at Syrian forces, and he made a point of saying that this was directed at Syria, not at Russia. We know that Mattis had concerns that he expressed to the president about how an attack like this, if larger or under any circumstances, risks an escalation with Russia, which has an enormous military presence in Syria. And you're seeing some of that response here. I will say, Don, I think you should be prepared for, in the coming days, Russia to attempt to take advantage of the U.S. Granting that it doesn't have hard proof of the use of a nerve agent here. Russia likes to find fissures like that. It likes to take advantage of questions like that, and therefore question the overall justification for the U.S. attack. They're very skilled, as we know at times, at information warfare, and I wouldn't be surprised if they try to take advantage of that for propaganda purposes going forward.
Jim, quick note to you and quick response. Also, they're making it plainly clear there was no coordination with Russia, with the Russians, nor did they pre-notify them.
That's exactly right. I mean, he did say, Mattis, that there was communication between deconfliction channels, which they have set up, a hotline, as it were, between U.S. and Russian forces there, so that U.S. forces don't get in close proximity to Russian forces, so they don't end up shooting at each other. But no courtesy advance warning of this, purely deconfliction, so no discussion or commiseration in advance of this attack.
He also called out, Jim, the Russian promise that in 2013 that they would guarantee the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons, and also Mattis in that press briefing as well.
That's right, and a fair thing to do, and probably you can imagine the president calling out, in effect, the Obama administration for the deal made in following that previous use of chemical weapons, when President Obama at the time considered a military response, backed off that red line, developed this deal with Russia, the OPCW, others, to remove all the chemical weapons. It is very clear that all the chemical weapons were not removed, because we've seen the Syrian regime use them repeatedly since then.
Jim Sciutto, stand by. I want to get now to CNN military analyst Major General James Spider Marks. General, it's good to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure,
you heard the Pentagon briefing earlier. What can you tell us about the targets of this attack, and give us your takeaway here?
Well, thank you, Don. Yeah, let me walk you through what I heard both General Dunford and General Mattis describe. Obviously, it was guarded. They didn't give away all the secrets and all the planning considerations. But what's important to realize is that they stated very emphatically that they wanted to degrade, which is a military term for the reduction of a capability, degrade Assad's capabilities to deliver chemical weapons. So that means stockpiles, command and control, intelligence collection, delivery means, and most importantly, research and development. So let me go to the map if I can, Don. What we saw tonight was very strong targeting that has taken place in Damascus, and this is where the research and development capability is located. That essentially is target priority number one. In addition, stockpiles of chemical weapons were struck in and around Damascus, as well as Homs. And if you'll notice that Homs is the location, outside of Homs is the location of the Shirot Air Base, which is where a year ago the United States struck against Assad. Additionally, there are indications of attack up here in Aleppo. Now, what's important about that is that in the vicinity of Aleppo is where we have U.S. forces. So clearly there's proximity, but there was absolutely no danger and sufficient offset. So this is what we know from tonight's initial wave of strikes. Whether there will be a restrike, General Mattis indicated there wouldn't be, but we also heard from the president that there might be a sustained effort. We'll have to see what that looks like. But the interim between now and tomorrow begins a very robust process of battle damage assessment and effects-based determinations, assessments, if you will, of what took place. Let me also now show you where the allies are located. Obviously, most of the strikes probably came from this location here, where both the French and the U.S. are located because of the proximity to targets within Syria and the closure time on those targets. The U.S. has presence in Turkey. The Brits are in Cyprus. The U.S. always maintains presence in the Mediterranean. We also know now that the U.S. is transiting up through the Red Sea. It doesn't have to go through the Suez and join the forces here in the Med. That could get a little bit crowded, but could stay in the Red Sea to go either north, or it could go south and get back into the Indian Ocean. And we also have forces that are down here. This is where the strikes came from. I think what's important to realize here as well is that Russian forces in Syria are co-located in many locations where Syrian forces are. What we see here, this indicates that Russian forces are here. It's also a location of where Syrian forces are. So you have strike packages that might be going into locations like this, or in Damascus where you have proximity. You need to have standoff. We do not want to go to war with Russia. That is not the intention. Escalation is not the objective. De-escalation, on the other hand, is, but to take Assad's chemical weapons capability off the table in terms of how he can go forward with that as a weapons system. It needs to be degraded. We know that it's not going to be defeated and eliminated completely, but we want to give him every opportunity to shelve that capability and never touch it again based on the results of these strike packages this evening.
If I can just jump in here, General, let's just talk a little bit more about the equipment used. Again, you mentioned one U.S. Navy warship used, B-1 bombers used, and the reason I'm asking you that, located in the Red Sea, as you have indicated there, is you said a little over double the weapons this year as last year. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, the key thing is, if we go to this map here, correct, let me stay on this map here. What happened last year is we attacked this location exclusively, Shirot, one airfield, and we went after many aircraft which were in covered bunkers and protected, and we went to nullify the use of the airfield by using munitions that would destroy the airfield. What happened, however, is that immediately after you leave the strike, the Syrians come in and they can cover that back over, and the airfields are back in use. We also achieved some bomb damage assessment and attrition against the Air Force. This strike, however, includes not only this location, but increased location here in Damascus, which means there was some very precise, as General Mattis indicated, some collateral damage assessments a priori to minimize civilian casualties. But let's be frank. They went after the R&D capabilities, and they went after the C2 capabilities that Assad has. They also went after intel in a big way, because that's how they develop their packages, and with the R&D, that's how they develop all the additional capabilities. In addition to that, strikes here in Homs and in the vicinity of Aleppo. Yeah. Very large package in a very strong wave Now we'll determine what the United States wants to do with the possibility of a restrike based on an assessment of these capabilities and these strikes this evening.
General Marks, appreciate the information. I want you to stand by. I want to bring in now CNN military analyst Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona and also Colonel Cedric Layton. Good to have you both on. CNN has learned that both ships and aircraft were used in this operation. How specifically would they have been used? Mr. Francona?
Well, the ships would be launching the Tomahawk missiles, and the B-1 bombers carry the air-launched cruise missile. Similar capability, different warhead, but the effects are still the same. They can fire them from a standoff distance, and they're safe, as can be. You don't want to get into the teeth of the Russian-supplied air defense system when you don't need to. Now, the cruise missiles can be engaged because they're nothing more than just another aircraft or unmanned, but they have the same flight characteristics. So they can be engaged by the Syrian air defense. The Syrians have claimed that they shot some down, so we'll have to see how successful that is. So what we're going to do now is do a battle damage assessment to find out how effective the strikes were, how the weapons performed, and then make another assessment. Do we need to go back and restrike the targets? Have we achieved the required or desired level of damage to provide whatever it was we were trying to do? And as General Mattis and General Dunford said, we're trying to deter the Syrians from doing this again. So we'll know in short order how effective those strikes were.
Colonel Layton, the Syrian government has claimed that they have struck down or they hit a Tomahawk missile. Can you talk to me about that? They don't always tell the truth.
That's right, Don, and I think it's highly unlikely. What they normally end up doing is they try to, of course, tell their population that they've been defending the motherland and they've done great heroic things against the U.S. aggressor. In this particular case, I think it's highly unlikely that they were able to engage and take down a Tomahawk missile. It is technically possible for them to do so, especially using the Russian S-400 system and the associated weapons system with that. However, highly unlikely that they did that because there are a lot of Russian controllers that are there, and they may have been reluctant to allow the Syrians to engage the U.S. directly.
So the president talked about France and Great Britain being a part of this operation. What do they bring to the table?
Well, France and Britain have some unique capabilities. The British are very good in the intelligence realm. The French also have an intelligence capability that is actually a vestige from colonial times where they actually were in Syria after World War I. But the big things that they bring to the table are basically support. They have some weapon systems such as the Rafale jets and Mirage jets that the French have. The British, in addition to their intelligence capability, have the Tornado jets that they can use, and they also have submarines that are out in the Mediterranean that have the capability to also launch Tomahawk missiles.
So let me ask you, Colonel Francona, with elements of Russian military on the ground in Syria, how much more difficult does this make all of this? Do they bring some technology, some equipment maybe to the table that Syria wouldn't otherwise have access to?
Oh, they bring tremendous capabilities that the Syrians don't have. If you look at the equipment the Syrians are using, much of it goes back to the Soviet era days. The Russians are bringing, of course, state-of-the-art. The S-400 system that Colonel Layton just mentioned is a state-of-the-art, world-class air defense system. It's optimized to shoot not only at aircraft, but also cruise missiles, specifically the Tomahawk. But if you look at the target set that was struck tonight, most of those areas were not protected by this S-400. So I don't think the Syrians would be very effective at knocking these things down. I did want to say one more thing after General Marks's rundown, excellent rundown of where things were. I just want to talk to that target set in Damascus. You remember General Mattis and General Dunford said one of the things that they took into consideration was the minimization of civilian casualties. And then they talked about striking the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center. I lived in Damascus, and I lived not too far from that area. This is right in the middle of a heavily, densely populated area. And for us to put cruise missiles in that area indicates a high confidence in our ability to put those missiles right into that and not hit the surrounding civilian population. This is much different than what we did last year when you were striking a relatively isolated airfield. So it will be interesting to see if we were able to minimize civilian casualties in that Barzi area.
Yeah. General Marks, there was a bit of confusion, so to speak. Maybe they weren't on the same message, who knows. A confusion in languaging. The president saying it was a sustained attack. Secretary Mattis said earlier no additional attacks planned, that this was going to be a single attack unless Assad didn't get the message. A one-time strike like this, and saying it's a one-time strike, why telegraph? Because there's been so much criticism, especially from this particular president, about telegraphing to the enemy what we're going to do.
Well, Don, I think in this particular case, what's very, very interesting is the divergence between what the president said in terms of a sustained effort and what Secretary Mattis said in terms of this being the strike. Really allows the United States and its allies the option to go back if this alliance, this partnership, hasn't achieved the results that are necessary. I can't speak for the president or any of these gentlemen, but what I can say is the president's saying this is a sustained effort. We don't necessarily just have a quantifiable number of cruise missiles we're going to launch, and when they're done, we're out. What this alliance is trying to achieve is effects on the ground. The destruction or the degradation or the elimination, whatever the verb is that's trying to be achieved. And if this strike did not achieve that, the United States, the French, and the British reserve the right, based on their constitutional rights, to protect their best interests, and they'll go back after these targets to achieve those results. It's perfectly, in fact, I think it was a wise decision on the part of Secretary Mattis to say, look, this is what we planned and this is what we executed. But everybody made it perfectly clear, General Dunford, Secretary Mattis, that there will be an assessment process. There may be new strikes that come in the next couple of days. We don't know, but we need to see what that assessment looks like.
General Marks, Colonels Layton and Rick Francona stand by. This is our breaking news tonight. President Trump announcing the U.S., the UK, and France have launched precision strikes on Syria tonight. I want to bring in now CNN senior diplomatic correspondent Michelle Kaczynski, CNN Global Affairs analyst Kimberly Dozier, and Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. So grateful to have all of you on this evening. Michelle, talk to me about the scope of this and the long-term effects, if any.
Hi, Don. Right. I mean, we knew that this was going to likely be bigger than what the U.S. did a year ago. How much bigger? That was a question. We knew that there were some competing factions within the White House and outside within the president's cabinet to try to figure out how much further to go without truly escalating the situation to the point that it would be dangerous to U.S. interests. So to hear that there were 3 locations, I think to many people, it's a surprise that there were so few, but you see how they wanted to target this. To have it focused on chemical weapons capability. Remember, last year's was just part of an airfield. That was in launch capability for chemical weapons. Now we have 1 research and development facility and 2 other storage facilities, one of which included a command post. So they're really focusing on the chemical weapons themselves, although when you look at research and development, that is only one of those locations. Although you heard officials tonight saying that that could account for maybe years of research and data. They felt like it would damage the Syrian regime, but there are other possible targets. They just didn't want to hit those at the risk of hitting either foreign forces or civilians. So long term, you know, we heard what they said. This is obviously expanded from last year, but still quite limited in scope. They chose that middle ground to walk a line between doing something more and not escalating it too much. Yeah. Will it have a huge effect or immediately? That's really going to be in the message sent. And I think that's what you heard U.S. officials focus on tonight, that this is sending a message that this isn't going to be targeted. This time it's not just the U.S., but it's allies too. And let's see what you do next, because if there is continued attacks, and we don't know exactly what the red line is here this time, then there could be, as the president said, sustained response.
Kimberly Dozier, to you now. You know, we know that the U.S. was communicating with Russia to try to avoid any accident or escalation, but they say that it was they didn't pre-warn them. It seems like that was successful, correct?
Well, they were using the standard communication that they use with Russia every single day to deconflict coalition airstrikes with Russian air operations. General Dunford was very careful to say they didn't coordinate, as in they didn't let them know what they were about to hit. But consider this volley of strikes an opening salvo by a new coalition, the U.S., Britain, and France. They have sent a message that we know where your weapons are being manufactured, we know where you're storing them, and we can ratchet this up if you try this again. The last time they did this punishing strike back in April last year, there was a cessation of chemical weapons reports of their use for at least a few months before it started again. The other thing that you have to look at is there are weapons inspectors on the ground right now that the UN had said we're going to go and investigate that site. Will this strike tonight empower them, or will Assad now say, well, I was working with the international community, but why should I let them inspect the site when you already punished me, you already were judge, jury, and executioner?
Kimberly, CNN has been told that from a senior official, U.S. official, that John Bolton, Nikki Haley, both supportive of the stronger campaign of strikes that Trump has been pushing for. It is the Pentagon and General Mattis who are holding out. How did this play out? How did they come to some sort of consensus to launch these airstrikes?
Well, I think from General Mattis's point of view, or Secretary Mattis, he knows that these things can produce a lot of blowback. He's already warned there's going to be a disinformation campaign that starts probably as soon as the sun comes up, which is very shortly in Syria, where they'll say likely that there were civilian casualties hit, or perhaps that some of the chemicals spread and cause damage. Who knows what sort of stories we're about to hear. Mattis also knows that there is at this point no long-term strategy for Syria moving forward. That is still very much, from the Trump administration's point of view, in flux. Yeah. So you can find yourself getting pulled into something with a military campaign that isn't thought out with an end game. Where does this go? It seems very reactionary. They've reacted to Assad's continuing WMD use, and now they have to see what Assad is going to do next.
Nicholas Kristof, we know that the president, he didn't like the options that were presented to him. He wanted a stronger, and quicker action, quicker than this. Did he get what he wanted, the president?
It sounds like he did not. It sounds like he made a speech that reflected his larger ambitions when he talked about that sustained attack. But in fact, what seems to have unfolded so far, certainly what Secretary Mattis described, was more limited. And I think that reflects the fact that when you're in the White House Situation Room, it's very easy to plan massive campaigns. If you were in the Pentagon, you remember that in 1999, when we were bombing Belgrade and the Kosovo operation, it was hard to imagine what might go wrong. And then we hit the Chinese embassy, and all of a sudden we had a crisis with China on our hands.